Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this RPG review I'm going to be reviewing this book, Lamentations of the Flame Princess, Weird Fantasy Role-Playing, Player Core Book, Rules and Magic. Now, for this review, I'm looking at a book that I stayed away from for quite some time, and that is, as I've said, the Lamentations of the Flame Princess core book. I've known about the existence of this OSR system for some time, but I've deliberately stayed away from it. This is because when you mention the game, you tend to get one of two reactions from people. You either get the, "Oh yeah, it's so extreme, blood, guts and boobs," or you get the, oh, that game, well, it's just a graphic fest with obscene art and modules. Now, I'm quite willing to admit that, like most people, if I hear something for long enough from enough people, then it tends to gain a sort of spiritual gravitas, I suppose you could call it. So for a long time, I avoided Lamentations of the Flame Princess, and it was only after hearing the game mentioned by a number of people whose RPG opinions that I respect that I decided to give it a go. And I must say, I've never been more happy to admit that my initial impressions were quite wrong. So if you're new to my reviews, this is how I've been doing them for a short while. I normally give a quick rating at the start based on 4 categories, which you'll see appear on the screen now. And that's so that if you just want to get a quick capture review, you can just listen to this bit. Whereas if you want a more detailed review, that will come afterwards. So let's crack on with the rating. So first of all, the writing. The writing of the book is clear, but manages to convey a subtle sense of the weird fantasy / dark atmosphere that is one of the game's main selling points. And it's a genre that I'm quite a big fan of, so I'm giving that a plus. Next, we have the look of the book. The book is small and easy to carry, which, if you watch my channels and my ramblings about RPGs, you know I think that's a big plus. The black and white art inside the book is very striking, and the colour artwork, while sometimes a little risque in some pieces, is well crafted and fits the mood of the game. The book also uses the interior front and back covers to feature a list of equipment and some useful charts, all in this striking and quite easy to read red and white colour scheme, which is a great use of an oft ignored space in a book. So again, it's a big plus for that. Now we come to the system. At its core, the Lamentations of the Flame Princess system is the old school level-based D&D that we're pretty much all familiar with. There are a few differences, such as the reduction in the number of classes available and the use of a D6 based skill system. Bottom line, if you're familiar with D&D, you won't have any problems adapting to this system, and if you're not, it's very easy to pick up. So again, it's a big tick and a plus from me. And finally, we come to the background of the book. And although it's largely a neutral system book, as you'd expect, in that it doesn't provide a full campaign setting, the writing of the book does a great deal to convey a sense of the sort of campaigns typical of Lamentations of the Flame Princess. The emphasis on maritime adventures in one of the chapters and an appendix on firearms later on in the book speaks to a more Renaissance or late era campaign than is typical of D&D. That's not to say that Lamentations of the Flame Princess can only be used for those sort of settings, but that's certainly the vibe I got from the book. And again, it's a period I think is woefully underused in the D&D style of game. So again, it's a big plus. As you can tell from those ratings, pluses across the board, I'm a big fan of Lamentations of the Flame Princess. And that's why it's going to be the first product reviewed to get a rating of
legendary.
So, in summary, Lamentations of the Flame Princess is a very well written and illustrated OSR game that will be easy for anyone familiar with D&D to get used to, and to be honest, won't be difficult for anyone to pick up. Although some of the artwork and the modules are a bit more on the risque side, if that sort of thing bothers you, the player core book and magic is by and large a tightly written version of the D&D style of rules that a GM can apply to whatever setting they decide to come up with. It's also hard to argue with a system that is available for free as a PDF online. If you're looking for a streamlined version of D&D that can easily be adapted to most campaign settings and that has numerous excellently written modules and supplements available for it, you cannot go far wrong with Lamentations of the Flame Princess. So, let's get on to a slightly more detailed breakdown. Chapter 1 is the character breakdown, and the book wastes no time in getting straight down to character generation. Most RPGers will be familiar with the idea of rolling for the 6 attribute scores: charisma, constitution, dexterity, intelligence, strength and wisdom. They're in a slightly different order on the character sheet than in most versions of D&D. Not sure why, but it really doesn't harm the game in any way. Depending on their attribute scores, the characters receive modifiers ranging from -3 to +3 for each of the attributes that will be used on various roles throughout the game. Players then choose a class for their character, and these consist of Cleric, Fighter, Magic User, Specialist, Dwarf, Elf and Halfling. That's right, demi-humans count as a class choice in Lamentations of the Flame Princess. This may not appeal to some people, but it's certainly a way of representing non-humans that has been used in older versions of D&D and OSR games since. One of the things that I noticed about the classes in Lamentations is that they all appear to be very, very focused. A fighter is the only class who improves their attack bonus past first level, whilst the specialist gains points that can be spent to improve their scores on certain skills. The cleric is the only class that seems a little out of place, in my opinion, seeming more like a concession to original D&D than fitting in with the main feel of Lamentations. Although I have heard rumours that the cleric is going to be removed or replaced in future editions of the game. We'll see whether that comes to pass or not. However, again, it's a very minor nitpick. It really doesn't impact the game. The dwarf can take a lot of punishment, carry heavy burdens, and has an improved skill at examining architecture and buildings. The elf has some magical ability, is competent in combat, and is good at searching for things, whilst the halflings are skilled at dodging blows and using their bushcraft abilities to find food and travel the wilderness. Each class has a single page write-up and a facing piece of black and white artwork. Each class gets a couple of paragraphs to sum up their essential flavour, and a table that gives all the relevant rules information for levels up to 10. The equipment chapter is next, and it's fairly no frills, but it does what I need an equipment chapter to do, providing me with the cost for the various pieces of equipment in silver pieces, since Lamentations of the Flame Princess uses a silver piece standard, along with any additional rules. For example, silver weapons cost 10 times more than standard weapons, and they have a 1 in 10 chance of breaking whenever they're used in an attack, even if the attack misses. Nice and simple. The chapter itself takes up only 4 pages. There isn't a lot of fancy artwork or lengthy descriptions of various bits of kit, which is good in the main, but it would have been nice to have some additional clarifications on certain little bits. For example, I'd love to know if there's any game difference between standard rations or iron rations, and if not, why not just have one type of ration? We then move on to the main meat of the system with the adventuring rules of the game chapter. It still takes less than a dozen or so pages. It's very concisely written, which is something I'm a big fan of. The chapter breaks down some of the most common situations you're likely to come across in a D&D-esque game, covering the things that you can do with various game skills, how you gain XP, which, if you're interested, is basically fighting monsters and uncovering treasure, in case you're wondering, foraging for supplies, combat, various ways you can suffer damage, how to heal people, and other such things. Resolving most tasks in the game, combat, saving throws, etc., is a matter of rolling a d20 and either getting above or below a target number. Skill use is resolved as a chance out of 6, depending on your score. So, for example, if you have a bushcraft score of 1 in 6 and you want to find some nourishment in the wild, you pick up a d6 and roll it. If you get a 1, you're successful, otherwise you aren't. Simple as that. The next chapter is called Maritime Adventures, and it came as a bit of a surprise to me. I'd never really equated D&D with maritime adventuring before I cracked open Lamentations of the Flame Princess, but as someone who loves pirate-themed games, it seems sort of right to have it included, especially in a game like Lamentations of the Flame Princess, which seems to lean towards campaigns set a little later than the typical faux medieval era beloved of many a D&D campaign. This section has crew numbers, speeds, hit point totals and cargo capacity for a large variety of ocean-going vessels, ranging all the way from a tiny raft up to a frigate. Simple systems are given to adapt combat for ocean-going encounters and for chases involving ships. If you were doing a campaign with major focus on naval encounters, you might want to expand on this a bit, but it's certainly a good start and will be more than enough for most campaigns. Now in the next chapter we're back on familiar territory, talking about retainers. It's all about hirelings and those people who aren't quite adventurers themselves, but they're hired by adventurers because they possess useful skills or abilities. Like many of the chapters in this book, we begin with a table that provides wages and the space requirements of various hirelings, from accountants to mercenaries and scholars. Retainers require a certain wage, they also need a certain amount of living space provided for them, as detailed on the table. In return, each hireling provides either a bonus to a task that the PC might undertake. For example, the alchemist reduces times needed for magical research by 1d6 days, or they provide a useful skill in their own right. For example, mercenaries are hired 20 at a time, and for every 10, one will be a sergeant. They count as 0 level fighters, and sergeants count as 1st level fighters. The next chapter is another surprising gem and talks about property and finance, going into ways that rich PCs can invest their wealth, becoming property magnates and investing in businesses such as mercantile enterprises. Although this section is only a couple of pages long, it addresses one of the fundamental issues with D&D style games as far as I'm concerned, that of high-level adventurers who just waddle around carrying sack upon sacks of money, or they just stash it somewhere and it really does nothing. Unless you have magic shops, what do you spend that fantabulously hard-earned cash on? The simple system for investing in Lamentations of the Flame Princess gives you a way to grow your cash in downtime and invest in the game world, whilst keeping the mechanics simple. Growing an investment portfolio isn't the main focus of the game after all. The next chapter is called Encounters, and it deals with the business end of combat, breaking down encounters into a number of easy-to-manage steps, from when the various forces spot each other to launching attacks and casting spells. There are a number of things a PC can do to improve their chance of successfully hitting a target, such as aiming for a round or attacking from behind. These mostly add to an attack roll, but you can also gain bonuses to your armor class or your AC by using cover or by going on a full defense, making you harder to hit. I'm running a Lamentations campaign at the moment, which I'll put a link to in the description, and one thing that has proven particularly deadly is firing into melee. Essentially, when you fire into a swirling melee, your target is randomized. If you take a full round to aim, then one possible target of your choice counts as 2 for the purpose of randomization. But even with this bonus, firing into melee is an incredibly risky proposition, which sort of feels right to me. I mean, after all, although your electronic miniatures or your actual miniatures or your marks on a piece of paper or whatever are static, in real life people will be sidestepping, dodging, ducking. It will be quite chaotic. It will be incredibly difficult even for a skilled marksman to draw a bead on someone under those circumstances. The book then has a series of colour plates and a couple of black and white art pieces. Although the subject matter of these pieces is a little on the gruesome side, they are great pieces of art and help reinforce the feel the game is reaching for. And, to be honest, the game does have an 18+ rating for explicit content on the cover, which you can see there. So, it's not as if you haven't been warned, to be perfectly honest. The next section is all about clerics, and it covers how they gain their spells and what sort of magical stuff they can create. The actual spell descriptions are featured in a later chapter. Essentially, clerics can cast any spells from their list, and don't use spellbooks. They have to rest for 6 continuous hours and meditate/pray for a number of hours equal to the level of the highest spell being prepared. Spells use the fire and forget or Vancian system that anyone who's played D&D in the past will be familiar with. A memorized spell remains in memory until used, at which point it's forgotten. Clerics can cast clerical spells from scrolls and also scribe their own spells onto them, provided they have the money and the equipment necessary. Clerics can also make holy water, and there is an interesting small section describing how a cleric can research or invent new spells, which I think will be a great way of allowing spells from other OSR games and D&D style games to be brought into Lamentations of the Flame Princess. The next chapter is magic users, and it's pretty similar to the previous one, save that it deals with arcane spellcasters instead of the divine. Magic users have a spellbook containing the spells they know and are able to memorise, by resting for 6 hours and prepping for a number of hours equal to the highest level spell being memorised, their spells. Magic users use arcane spell scrolls and create potions, staffs and wands. They can also invent and research their own spells. The next 2 chapters provide a list of spells for the 2 different types of spellcasters in the game. They're pretty much what you'd expect. The clerics get healing, purifying, cure disease and turn undead style spells, while the magic users get animate dead, teleporting, charms, offensive spells and other such stuff that you'd expect. And the next chapter is called Spell Descriptions, and it breaks down how the spells actually work in game. The spells are well written and provide information to help resolve common situations that occur when the spells are used. The chapter does pretty much what you'd expect it to, in a nice, no-nonsense fashion. There is one major exception, and that is the summon spell. In Lamentations of the Flame Princess, this spell, which in other D&D style games generally involves just summoning a creature off a list, useful but pretty boring, is effectively just tearing a hole in reality and summoning a creature from beyond into the world. Effectively, the caster chooses the power level of the creature, they make a spell save, failure resulting in a more powerful or a more uncontrollable creature arriving, and then they randomly determine the form and the characteristics of the creature summoned. I both love and hate this spell in equal measure. I love it because as a GM, I can see it being great for those mad mage summons Cthulhuoid monstrosity from the Great Beyond style scenarios. However, to be honest, I don't see a lot of players wanting to take the spell, certainly people I've spoke to, because of how dangerous it is and because of how long it would take to do all the rolls to work out the qualities of the creature summoned. But again, it's one spell, it's hardly a make or break point. We then round off the book with a few appendices. The first one is a glossary, and I'm a huge fan of glossaries, so it's great to see one tucked at the back of this book, providing capsule descriptions of terms commonly used throughout the text. We then have an appendix on firearms, and it provides rules for firearms and various later period armours. Firearms aren't to everyone's taste in D&D style games, and that's fair enough, but they do suit the more Renaissance/later time period that Lamentations seems to favour. Personally, I think these rules work great. Now, don't get me wrong, using these rules, you aren't going to be swinging into combat rapid-firing SMG style with aplomb. Hell, a matchlock weapon takes 10 rounds to reload, or 8 if you're a fighter. These rules really put me in the mind of the firearms in the Sharp series of novels and TV specials and things like that, which I'm a big fan of. If you're in the cut and thrust of a combat, you might get 1 shot up, if you're lucky, maybe 2, and the conditions aren't damp. The main advantage of firearms lies in intimidating your opponent. If you successfully blast off one of your firearms, then your opponents will be making a morale check straight away because of the smoke, the loud noise, the crack of the gun, etc. And that can be almost as useful as any damage done by the gun itself. The final short appendix in this book provides an illustration of the default Lamentations character sheet. Each section on it is numbered or lettered and has a description on the facing page, effectively making a sort of character sheet cheat sheet, something I found very useful when needing to quickly reference something during the game. So, In conclusion, as I said at the start of this review, if you can get past, or you're not bothered by, the weirdness factor of Lamentations of the Flame Princess, then what you will get for your money, assuming you don't go for the free PDF, is a very neatly written and streamlined OSR game that provides some additional cool bits for you to take your game beyond the default faux medieval era that many D&D style games espouse. Currently, there is no GM book available for this edition, although the previous edition's GM book is freely available and well worth a read. I'll put a link to that in the description below. But I have heard rumours of a new edition of Lamentations on the horizon. If and when the new edition comes out, I will be eagerly waiting in the queue to get a copy. I think Lamentations is a great game, well worthy of the legendary rating that I've given it. I'm glad I looked past my initial prejudices and gave it a chance. If you want a neat D&D style system with an emphasis on the weird and a focus on the slightly later Renaissance period, you really cannot go far wrong with this book. I highly recommend it. So there you are. That was my review of Lamentations of the Flame Princess. As I say, it's a game I'm running a campaign of at the moment. I'll put a link to my campaign playlist down below. And I've also made a cheat sheet for it, just referencing some common rules that I use myself. And I'll put a link to that down below. If you're interested, I highly advise you to go out and have a look at it using the links to the free PDFs. After all, it's free. What have you got to lose? And if you enjoy it, grab yourself a copy of the hard copy, throw some pennies the author's way. It really is a most worthwhile OSR book, and I highly recommend it. So if you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel. Until I see you next time, take care and happy gaming.